when you look across the literature as a whole, there are still a lot of questions that remain around these different dietary interventions. There were certainly some people who didn't appreciate, us talking about the skeletons in the closet, but that's the way it goes.
Hello, and welcome to Existential Threads. So today we'll talk about some of those very trendy diet and lifestyle changes that we hear a lot about, like intermittent fasting and keto and calorie restriction. And we'll see what the science actually says, if they're really worth the trouble. Also, some huge downsides that very few people talk about. The perfect person for this conversation is Matt Kaeberlein, who is a renowned expert on the biology of aging. And he actually took the time to dedicate to delving into this literature about nutrition, which was very interesting to me. So let's get into it. And at the end, I will also share the principles that I've adopted when it comes to my diet, as a result of reading this paper a few years ago, and also this recent discussion with Matt, which was very eye-opening for me. I hope for you too. First, I was just curious about why a busy guy like Matt took the time to work on nutrition and clarifying what we know about nutrition currently.
There was some misunderstandings about, these different dietary regimens that had been sort of popularized not only within the general public, but even within the scientific community, who study the biology of aging. And so we really, dove into the question of really trying to address a couple of issues. One is, if you really look at the literature as a whole, how much evidence is there that variations of caloric restriction, like protein restriction or ketogenic diet or intermittent fasting, on their own extend lifespan or health span once you actually control for caloric consumption, right? And it turns out there really isn't, at least for ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting and time-restricted feeding, very little evidence once you take out the caloric restriction piece that they really do much at all in mice. And then also this question of how much can we extrapolate from the animal studies to human biology. And so we just tried to take an unbiased approach to really addressing those issues by looking at the literature as a whole, and also by recognizing that there is somewhat of a publication bias within the literature where, people tend to favor publishing positive results. And there are actually, if you go look for them, you can find plenty of studies where caloric restriction or other dietary interventions didn't have any effect on lifespan. Those tend to get buried and ignored in favor of the positive studies. And again, just trying to make the point that, when you look across the literature as a whole, there are still a lot of questions that remain around these different dietary interventions. And I think it was it was certainly beneficial for me in terms of learning a lot of the literature that I sort of knew about but had never done a deep dive into. And I think it had a beneficial impact on the field more broadly speaking, although there were certainly some people who didn't appreciate, us talking about the skeletons in the closet, but that's the way it goes.
I gotta say that this made me a bit upset because, I have some chronic conditions, nothing life-threatening, but I know that a lot of my friends are dealing with our own issues, and it makes us all much more vulnerable to this kind of information because we're kind of desperate to solve a problem. And, in our society, food is seen as something that will either kill you or save you, which is probably both are incorrect in most cases. And you have these experts, and I'm not talking about influencers, I'm talking about actual scientists from reputable institutions who just say things so confidently, giving advice to the masses, when now you can see that there is no actually solid data behind this. In the best case, it can work for some, but not for others. And it's not only that it's fluff that may just waste your time and make you frustrated, but it can also actually cause physical and mental harm. This also makes me wonder if, we should start looking at dietary interventions more like we look at drugs. When you're considering taking a new medication, you seriously weigh the benefits against the side effects. You consult your doctor. You try to understand what the consequences may be. And I think we should implement the same kind of thinking when it comes to making changes in the way we eat.
So what we mean when we talk about a dirty drug or a clean drug or a dirty intervention, a clean intervention, really just means how specific is the target, right? So from a biochemical perspective, a clean drug would be a drug that only impacts one protein, doesn't impact any other proteins, very, very specific. So rapamycin is a good example of a clean drug based on this definition, because as far as we know, it only impacts mTOR, which is the mechanistic target of rapamycin. That's a protein. And in fact, it only impacts one complex that mTOR acts in. So it's very, very specific. Contrast that to something like metformin, which has many, many targets, and really nobody actually knows for sure what the protein target is that leads to the anti-diabetic effects. It's probably not one thing. It's probably dozens of things. So that's what we mean by dirty and clean. Now, I think it is important to be clear that those are not, like when we say a dirty, at least when I say a dirty drug, it's not meant to be a negative thing. It's just describing the specificity. You can have a very, very potent drug that is very, very beneficial, and it can be also very dirty. You can have multiple targets. You may not know exactly how it's working. It's really just a biochemical definition. But I do think in the context of lifestyle interventions, those are all, as far as I can think of, very, very dirty, meaning they have many, many biological effects. So if you think about a dietary intervention, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands of chemical reactions in our bodies that are modified by relatively simple dietary interventions. Just think about, increasing your fiber by 100%, doubling the amount of fiber you eat. That's going to have a whole ton of different impacts biologically. It's not going to affect just one thing. So really any lifestyle intervention, exercise, sleep quality, all of these things are going to be very, very dirty. And so again, that doesn't mean they aren't very potent and can have beneficial effects, but it also increases the risk of side effects, because when you're modifying dozens or hundreds of different chemical reactions, the off-target effects potentially are going to be negative. And so that's important to recognize. And it also means that it is difficult to really do very mechanistic scientific studies of something like caloric restriction. I mean, we would all love to say that caloric restriction is increasing lifespan because it does X and it only does one thing, but that's probably not the case, because it does dozens of things that are probably all interacting to have the net effect that we see on longevity or reproduction or, a whole bunch of other traits or phenotypes that are modified by caloric restriction.
So we've established that lifestyle interventions can have more significant and dangerous side effects than medication. That also applies to natural supplements or any treatment and therapy that we look at as something kind of benign because it doesn't require a prescription. What's interesting is that even the gold standard, in longevity circles, calorie restriction, that is known to be the one thing that we know extends lifespan and healthspan. Even that, as Matt tells us, is not true. There are cases where it causes just the opposite effect in animal models. And then, even if those animal studies weren't so contradicting, we need to really be careful when we extrapolate from animal studies to humans, because this is a very different environmental and also biological situations. So let's see what Matt has to say about that.
I personally think we have to be very careful extrapolating from the animal studies to humans when we're talking about something like caloric restriction. So again, this mostly comes from rodent studies, mice and rats. Mice recently, rats have sort of, in the last few decades become less commonly used. And in the mouse studies, these are almost always genetically inbred lines. So they're not like people where we're genetically diverse. They're usually a single genotype, and all of the animals are genetically roughly identical to each other. And they live in this very controlled, very sterile environment. And that's completely different than the human situation. And you mentioned bone density and muscle mass. Mice, at least, don't really tend to get a lot of sarcopenia as they get older, which is loss of muscle mass. And bone density doesn't really seem to be a limiting factor, at least for longevity in mice. But in people, we know in the elderly, loss of bone density and loss of muscle mass are the primary drivers of frailty, which leads to a whole host of other problems and mortality. And so, because caloric restriction certainly can have an impact on bone density and muscle mass as we're getting older, I would be much more concerned about decreased bone density and decreased muscle mass in people and potentially offsetting any longevity benefits there, as opposed to in mice where that probably isn't offsetting the longevity benefits. So this may be a case where caloric restriction actually is very potent from an anti-aging perspective in people. It very, very well might decrease the rate of biological aging, but that doesn't really matter if you're aging more slowly, but you fall down and fracture your hip and die. You're still not living longer. So I think that's a nice case example where an unanticipated consequence that really isn't a problem in the laboratory animals becomes potentially a huge problem in people. I think infections are another place where this is a good case. Again, because mice in the lab are in this sterile environment, they're called specific pathogen-free facilities. They aren't exposed to the same kinds of constant, pathogens that humans are. We know caloric restriction can have a negative impact, at least acutely, on immune function. It may increase the risk of infection. It may increase the risk of, dying due to something like influenza or COVID-19. Again, that would offset any benefit you might get, even if you're aging more slowly. So those are the kinds of things that it's worth just thinking about as we try to extrapolate from the animal studies to humans.
It is really hard to accept this truth about, I think, life in general, that an intervention or an event can be both good and bad. It can help us in many ways and at the same time be detrimental in other ways. Additionally, what we can't really see when it comes to animal studies is the mental impact of certain interventions. And when I say mental impact, not only suffering itself, but how it impacts our lives and our physical health as a result as well.
Particularly a very restrictive dietary or lifestyle regimen, certainly for some people could create, social anxiety, loss of relationships, a higher stress. You would anticipate that those things, could have certainly a detrimental effect on quality of life and potentially quantity of life as well. And again, in mice, that's not really an issue. They don't have a choice. That's the other thing that's different, right? For people doing caloric restriction, it's a choice, right? You're constantly bombarded with all of these food cues, right? You can't walk down the street without smelling a fast food restaurant. So it is a different situation where you're making a choice. You are, to some extent, I think almost everybody is going to feel like they are, restricting themselves voluntarily, which is hard to do for a lot of people. And so that also may create stress. Again, being fair, that's also possibly could have some beneficial effects. I think we just really don't know because it's so complicated in humans. And there are the mental health components where certainly some people are susceptible to eating disorders and things like that when they try to go on these very restrictive lifestyle regimens. And again, we don't really that's not something that we can model well in the laboratory animals.
So just a side note, with all this talk about the mental impact of nutrition, I couldn't help but wonder about, the similarities between eating disorder language like pro-Anna style and the biohacking tech bro kind of advice for longevity. And it's so similar sometimes that it's just striking. I know the context is different, and of course the intention and the goals are different. And I think women, we are slightly more sophisticated about these things just because we've been exposed to diet messaging since we can remember ourselves, most of us. So we kind of recognize the red flags. But for men, maybe it's processed in a different way. And it's interesting to see that difference while noticing that it can sound and look very similar. Anyway, with all this debunking, I was wondering if Matt had anything that he did feel confident about when it comes to nutrition.
So eating a quality diet, and this is where I think very rapidly you get into the gray areas. But there are some things that probably everybody would agree falls under the category of quality diet, right? So reducing highly processed foods for sure, reducing foods that have a lot of added sugars, I think almost universally is going to be a net win. Cutting out fast food. Reducing alcohol, I think, is a big one for a lot of people. I know that, it's kind of interesting because there's now, it feels like, at least among some of the influencers, there's this push to like, all alcohol is bad. And, I think you can make an argument, certainly based on the epidemiology, that may not be exactly correct. But the challenge is for a lot of people, one drink a day suddenly becomes 2 or 3 or 4. So I think in general, for most people, reducing alcohol and probably cutting it out completely is for most people probably a win. Those things, I think, it's hard to argue too much with. Once you get past that, I think then it really becomes individual. Whatever you're eating, right? Eat a high quality diet, especially if you're calorically restricting, intermittent fasting. I think this is one of my concerns with the GLP-1 agonist drugs, which work really well. They are very potent at helping people lose weight, largely because they suppress appetite. The problems we run into there is if people are eating less, but they're still eating crap, you're getting less of the nutrients you need. And that's a problem. So I think focusing on the quality of the diet is super important. And the other challenge with the GLP-1 agonists is most of the people who lose weight, at least from the literature that I've seen, don't take steps to maintain bone density and muscle mass. And so there's a corresponding loss, certainly of muscle mass. About half the weight that's lost seems to be muscle mass. That's potentially problematic if you regain the weight, because you're probably not going to regain the muscle mass. So coupling weight loss with resistance training, I think, is important. And I would argue also with a higher protein composition in the diet. So those are the kinds of things that I think about. But I try really hard not to get too far into the everybody should eat X amount of protein or everybody should, be ketogenic. I don't think that's realistic. That doesn't work. There's too much variability in what works for people.
This was really eye-opening. Here's what I've decided to do. First of all, I remind myself that, the history of nutrition, science, and recommendations for the masses has changed so much. There are things that we look at from, I don't know, even 10, 20 years ago that today we say, what? How could they think that is helpful or healthy? And I'm sure there are things we do today that would seem completely crazy in 20 years from now. So when I hear nutrition advice these days, here are a few things that I ask myself before I decide to do anything. First, I just try to find out, what is the trial based on? What is the nature and size of the trial? 2, have there been human trials? So is it only based on animal trials, which, as we know, is really limited in how much we can extrapolate for humans? 3, has it been placebo-controlled? This is really important, and we talk about it at length in the video that we'll link here below. 4, this is not foolproof, but, using my common sense. Does it make sense to eat all of my food of the day in 2 hours? Or does it feel like my stomach hurts just thinking about it? 5, how would this change make my body feel, my gut, my sleep, etc.? 6, how would it make my mind feel? Would it make me go crazy and think about food all the time and obsess all the time? And most importantly, and maybe that's the first question that I need to ask myself before I make a change in the way I eat is, what's my real motivation? Like, to really be honest and ask myself, okay, why am I doing this? Could it be peer pressure? Could it be virtue signaling? Could it be the need to control my body or my body size? And could it be, in my case, often health anxiety? So after I've explored all these questions, I at least have some idea of whether it's worth further exploring what is being offered. But otherwise, I really don't rush to make changes because, as we said, nutrition is like a drug in a way, and making changes can have serious side effects. So I take it quite seriously before I make that decision. Lastly, we all crave certainty, and food feels like something we can control. But nutrition science is very far from being in a place where we can really know for sure what's the right way to eat. And it seems that the right way to eat is different for different people in different circumstances, environments, and stages of life. So what I try to do is just to enjoy the food I love and that feels good with the people I love, and to relax about it. I know relaxing is a bit hard for some of us, but we try. But I invite you to join us in part 2, where Matt goes way more into detail about what we can do as individuals to maintain and improve our health. He also talks about his very exciting project. So I hope to see you there. And thanks so much for sticking around.